This morning, the latest in the war between Israel and Hamas. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is now in Egypt for meetings there focused on securing a new ceasefire. He met yesterday with officials in Saudi Arabia as part of his fifth diplomatic visit to the region since the war began with the Hamas attack of October the 7th. Now, this is new video of Blinken's meeting with Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. The two leaders expected to discuss Israel's military campaign. Now, Israel's defense minister has said forces will eventually advance all the way to Rafah in the south. Rafah situated right on Gaza's border with Egypt. Egyptian officials are concerned about what that would mean for the more than 1 million people who are sheltering in the city. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says this morning more than 27,500 people have been killed since the war began. Let's bring in Chris Brown, who's part of our CBC News team covering the war. He's in Jerusalem with me live this morning. And good to see you, Chris, as always. The fifth visit to the region for Antony Blinken, and still very high stakes. What are his priorities today as he meets with Egyptian leaders and then looks beyond to further meetings in neighboring countries?
It is a bit of a hopscotch Antony Blinken's doing around the region, as you say, in Egypt, then to Qatar, and then to Israel, and then over to Ramallah in the West Bank. His prime directive appears to be several-fold: to prevent so many of the shooting wars that we've seen in this region from getting worse, while at the same time trying to set the stage for a longer-term peace between Israel and Palestinians. And if it's not peace, at least it's not war. And the first order of business that's essential for all of the other plans to fall into place is a pause in the war between Israel and Hamas. It's why the Houthis have said they're attacking ships in the Red Sea, why Hezbollah says it's firing on northern Israel, and why groups such as the Islamic Resistance in Iraq have been attacking U.S. targets and their allies in Syria and Iraq. The decision on whether the fighting stops in Gaza is, of course, up to Israel and Hamas. Hamas is said to be considering a proposal to pause the fighting. For how long, we don't know, and for the return of Israeli hostages in exchange for the Palestinian detainees in Israeli jails. How many hostages, how many detainees, what would the time frame be? We really don't know, and it appears that one of the key issues for Antony Blinken is this time frame for a truce. A significant pause is the language that the Americans are using. Hamas wants permanency. Lots of deliberate leaks on the status of these talks. Israel's been spreading narratives that Hamas is split between leaders in Qatar and those on the ground in Gaza. That's the holdup, say the Israeli media commentators. One side wants a shorter pause, the other one wants a longer one, and so forth. Beyond that, the Americans have let it be known that they're fixed on a much larger horizon, Heather, one that sees, after the hostages and prisoners are swapped and the fighting paused, a defined plan for governing Gaza that would then lead to a two-state solution, Saudi recognition of Israel, and this grand remake of the Middle East, and all of it to a deadline of a November presidential election.
Incredible, Chris, when you frame it that way. I mean, this is your second stint covering the Israel-Hamas war. So many things have happened during the time, including, we were talking live, the day the International Court of Justice ruled on what has been happening in Gaza. But this second deployment for you is coming to an end. And I'm wondering, overall, what did you find changed this time? And what are your main observations, Chris, from this deployment?
What is so striking when you're here are these dueling narratives. Of course, we hear them in Canada all the time, but they're obviously intensely magnified when you're here. For example, in Israel, you really do not hear much about the plight of people in Gaza. As you said, those numbers, 27,000 dead. Voices in the Israeli media that raise this, they're considered outliers. And in fact, I think opinion has shifted to the right. Support for occupying Gaza after the war is rising. On the Palestinian side, there's also not much of any sympathy for Israel as a wounded country after October 7th, largely because Palestinians in the West Bank are dealing with their own surge of violence from Israeli settlers, and their economy is on the brink of collapse. The Americans and others, including Canada, are continuing to push for this two-state solution. But what's also striking is that leaders here aren't talking about it. There's no champion. Netanyahu is outright opposing it, and even on the Palestinian side, the Palestinian Authority is in the midst of reforming itself, so it could be a partner, but it's lost a lot of credibility in the street. Heather, you hear that all the time in Ramallah. People are fed up with the corruption and the complicity with Israel. And so there's a very huge void on that.
Chris, thank you for this conversation and for all the reporting. Chris Brown, part of our CBC News team, continuing to cover the war between Israel and Hamas. He's in Jerusalem today. This is CBC Morning Live.